Well, as you can see, I've got the 86 Monte Carlo back. If you've been following my channel for any time, you watched this car's transformation last year with the new paint job we put on it. Well, the owner's got everything back together on the car, for the most part, and he's brought it back for me to do a wet sand and buff on this car. Now, you might look at this car and say, well, it looks really good the way it is, and it does. The paint job actually came out really nice on it. The color laid down really well on it. But the clear coat has a few issues. It's got some orange peel in it, and it's got a few places I'll show you here. This is one right here. There's a sag right here in this fender, and there's a few other places on the car where I got a little bit of drips and sags. The temperature dropped when I was doing the clear coat on this car last year, I remember. It dropped during the day while I was performing the paint job on it, so it was kind of out of my control. But we're going to remedy all those. We're going to fix all those sags, drips, fix the orange peel, and make this car shine well enough that you'll be able to comb your hair on the side of it. So stay with me for this video, and I'm going to show you some tips on how to take out runs without fear of damaging the rest of the clear coat around it and actually sanding through. Because if you sand through the clear coat, you've got a big problem where you have to do some more paint repairs on the car. So I'll show you a tip that I've learned on how to sand those runs out and save your clear coat. So one of the first things we want to do to get this car ready for its color sand and buff is I'm going around and taping all the trim pieces, the weather strippings, the back glass molding piece, weather strip. Just want to have some protection on this for two reasons. One, we will be using a DA to do the first sand on most of the surfaces, and then secondly, when buffing all this, you don't want to have your buffer rubbing on this because it can cause problems with the buffing pad. It can discolor the trim and the rubber weather stripping, so you want to go ahead and cover all this stuff up with tape, and that'll protect it when you're sanding it and when you're buffing it. Before we get too far into the mechanics of color sanding our Monte Carlo, I want to talk about the tools we're going to use to get this task finished. You see a lot of things here on the bench that I have out. There's different stages you go through to color sand a vehicle. First, you want to use a more coarse sandpaper. Now, some of you might think of a coarse sandpaper as like a 120 grit, 180 grit, 80 grit. You don't want any of that anywhere near this vehicle. When you're talking about color sanding and coarse sandpaper, in my opinion, the coarsest I'm going to go is an 800 grit. And I only start with an 800 grit after a vehicle has been sitting, painted for a while. This car's been painted for a year. Now, if I was color sanding this vehicle right after the paint job was finished, a week or two after curing, or maybe 30 days, I like to let them sit about 30 days to gas off as much of these solvents as they can. I'll start with 1000 grit. So some of the things I have here are different sandpapers, sanding blocks, and tools that I use. To start on this car, I've been using my DA, and I've talked about this DA before. This is the same DA that I use when I'm doing my final primer sand. It has the tighter rotation in it, so it's not digging as much into your paint surface. And I also have this pad here that I can attach to my DA. And this is a soft foam pad, and they come in different thicknesses according to what you need. And it allows some flexibility with the paper. So if you're sanding on a curved surface, it will allow the paper to roll over the curve or get into a coved surface This pad makes that great for this type of paper to do that. Now this is the, I start here with the 800, like I said, because this paint has been on this car for a year, so it's cured really well. It's hard. So I got to start with a harder sandpaper. That'll get everything knocked down and get that orange peel out. And any dirt nibs or anything else that's in the paint, the 800 is going to take that out. Then I'll move to 1000 grit, which is the same type of paper, goes on my DA. And I'll go over the whole surface again just to kind of take out those 800 sand scratches. Now after I've gone through the whole car with the 800 and 1000 grit, then I'm going to move to my wet sanding process. The wet sanding process, I use a wet and dry sandpaper, and they come in sheets like this. These are smaller sheets made just for the size of your sanding blocks, and again, it's wet dry, so I do use this with water. If you use this dry, it clogs up really fast and you're going through paper like crazy. So if you use it with water, it allows the paper to glide over the surface and it doesn't get clogged up as quick. So I have several different sanding blocks that I use. When I'm sanding on a hard flat surface, I can use a harder block that doesn't flex as much. And I also will use this when I have to take out runs, which I'm going to do another piece on here shortly. This block is a dual density block. One side is a little harder than the other. So if you've got some curved surfaces that you're sanding over, this block will flex, it bends, you can bend it in all kinds of shapes. This side is a little bit more softer than the black side. Take your choice on which one you want to use. But these are good for your wet sanding purposes. So I'll start out with, if I'm going to take out a run, I'll start with 800 wet, and then I move to 1000 grit. But since we've already done the 1000 dry, I don't have to do my 1000 wet. So when I start my wet sanding process on this car, I'll go right to my 2000 and then my 3000 paper. So when you get to 3000 paper, you're almost starting to polish the paint with your sandpaper. You'll see it when you get finished with your 3000. You'll almost see a shine back in the paint. So after you've gone to 3000, now there's some guys out there that'll take their sanding process all the way up to 5000 grit sandpaper. I've never done it. I don't know what the advantages are to it really, other than it gets you closer to a polish and you have to spend less time with the buffer maybe. I don't know. So let's talk about the buffing process. After you've got everything sanded out, wet sanded, dried off, cleaned off, you wipe the car down again, you want to move to your buffing process. Now I came across this buffing process a couple years back. It's made by the Wizards company, and it comes with a DA type sanding, or a DA type buffer. There are two types. This is a DA type buffer, and then you have a rotary buffer. A rotary buffer is almost like a grinder, so you have to be extremely careful when you're buffing with a rotary grinder, because you can easily burn through edges and peaks and the corners where the paint is thinner. And that's why when you're sanding, you want to usually stay away from your edges. I like to stay back from my corners. I stay back from the edges of all my panels, just enough to where I'm not sanding on the edge, but I'm right up to it. So the buffing process starts out with, this system comes with 3 different pads. It has a microfiber wool pad that you use first with their compound. They have 2 types of compound. This is the only one I've used so far. It's called a Mystic Cut. It says it'll remove scratches up to 1200 grit sandpaper. So I've not tried it. I like to sand my things out to 3000. I just think it makes for a nicer job. So I will go over the entire car with my microfiber wool pad and bring the shine back to the paint. Next step is to go to their orange foam pad, which helps to remove swirl marks and gets your polish even higher. Next you go to, they have a gray foam pad, and basically this is for applying your final cut. They call it a Mystic Nano Wax, and this is really your final polish on the job. This will bring out the deep polish you see and leave a wax coating also on your buff job. So that's the basics of where we go and how we get the color sanding process started, start to finish, with your papers and different tools that we use, and then into the buffing process. As you can see, I've already been hard at work on getting this car sanded down. I'm going to do a little bit of tutorial on how I sand here in a little while, and I'm also going to show you some tricks on how to take out runs that you can get sometimes in the paint. So follow along with this. I think you'll enjoy watching this car go from what looks like a nice paint job to a sanded car back to a high gloss job. Alright, so the first step that we're doing in our color sanding process on this car, like I said, is to go over everything with 800 and get the orange peel knocked down and take out any of our dirt nibs. There's a few in this hood. It just happens with the paint booth that I have. I've got a few here. So these will all get knocked down flat. We'll get all this paint sanded down flat, get the orange peel out of it, and then, like I said, we'll go over it again with thousands. So what we do is just take our DA, just start sanding. And if you can see right there, there's a dirt nib. It leaves a ring around it and a high spot in the center. That's the piece of dirt. We're just going to sand it. We don't want to go too far over our edge. We don't want to break through the clear coat, because that just creates problems. Now you see, now this is pretty flat here. Our dirt nib is almost gone. We'll leave that go until we go over it with our 1000 grit. But you can see here, I'll do a top. When you just hit it, the orange peel shows up. You can really see it here. So this is what we want to achieve. This is how we start. And again, the 800 is just for knocking this down to get this flat quicker, because this is not a job you want to rush. Color sanding is a job that takes a lot of time. It's very tedious. You have to be very meticulous about it, because you don't want to break through your clear coat. If you break through your clear coat, you're repainting panels or the car, one of the two. So I'm going to go ahead and get all the rest of this car finished up with my 800 and 1000 grit, and then I'll bring you back when I start wet sanding. Alright, so I've been moving along on the car, and I've gotten to a spot where I've got a boo-boo when I painted. I've got a pretty decent run here, sag more because it's long. A run is just a single. Sag is a longitudinal mistake in your paint where it runs down. So I'm going to show you a trick on how to sand this out without fear of going through the rest of the clear coat around it. So what I've got here is just some of the polyester putty that I use when doing body work. This is the lighter putty. It's a scratch fill putty, and we're going to use this as a protection coat to the surrounding paint. So we just want to mix a little bit up, get it good mixed up, and then you're just going to take it. Now I know it's hard to see this this area that I'm talking about. Once I put this on, it'll come up clearer. And you just want to spread it more on your bottom side, because you want to protect the paint down on the bottom edge. So you're just putting a thin coat on. Along the whole length. As you can see, there's where the paint got heavy. So we're going to add just a little bit more down here. We'll bring it out some past it so that we don't damage our paint along here. Okay, so this is actually a pretty good sized run I got in it here. This was the worst spot on the car for some reason. And there's really no fear of this filler hanging around. One of the reasons is you're sanding all this anyhow, so you're going to end up sanding it off. And the second reason is it really doesn't adhere well to the paint, because this paint is sealed. It hasn't been scuffed, it hasn't been sanded in any way to give it that tooth that this putty it grips into to hold it into an existing finish on a paint job. So you basically, right now I could take this plastic spreader and just peel all this right off. But it will stick enough for you to go through a sanding process. And I'm going to show you that once this sets up and gets hard. I'm going to let it set up for a little while and go back to sanding on the rest of the car. And then I'll show you the process on how to sand out this sag here on the fender. Alright, our putty has had a good amount of time to set up now, so the next step we're going to do is to start sanding our area down. And I'm going to use an 800 grit wet dry paper. Now, some people may start a little rougher, maybe with a 600, but I like to lean towards the side of safety. Go with an 800. It may take a little bit longer to get it sanded down flat, but I have just fears of burning through or cutting through my clear coat and having to repaint panels, so I like to be a little cautious when I do this. So I've got two sanding blocks here. This is a harder density block. It has a little bit of flexibility to it, but it does have a harder surface, because you want that hard flat surface to make this area here where the runs are flat with the rest of the panel. This sanding block is a more softer block. It's more flexible. It moves more. But I'll use this one to clean off my area to check my progress as I go along. It's good for a squeegee too. So we've got some just straight water, and we want to wet the area down where we're going to be sanding. And go ahead and get our piece of paper wrapped up here on a block. And go ahead and get the paper wet down. Just clean it off a little bit. And you just want to keep this flat along here and just start sanding. You want to lean more towards where your runs are. Again, this putty is going to help protect the paint below it. So as you sand through everything, you're going to sand away your highest spots first. You see the high areas start to come through where it's starting to get darker here. You always want to keep your paper clean as you can. Keep your area lubricated with water. So you can see, as I'm sanding this away, how this helps to protect the surrounding paint. All this dark area is where the paint was heavy, the clear coat was heavy, and it made the run. And if you run your hand across it, this all feels level now because you've sanded down some of the run. You're sanding away at the fill putty. So you're taking this all down at the same pace. So when this is all, when the putty's gone here, this area is going to be flat, your run's going to be gone, and you'll be able to progressively sand it back out to a polish and then be able to compound this whole area out, and you'll never know that there was a run here. So if you see this little spots here where there's still putty, that means that there are still some high areas around there. And again, as you keep sanding, those areas will disappear. When everything disappears and there's nothing left but dark paint, that's when you know the panel's flat and your run is completely gone. So there you have it. That end of the run is now gone. This panel is now nice and flat. Now I just have to go back over all this area here, and I'll lightly get this sanded off, and that'll leave this, take out the rest of this run the same way, and we'll go back over it again with some 1000 grit wet paper, and that's going to leave this area ready to go into our 2000 and 3000 grit sanding and be ready for buffing. Okay, now that we've got the entire car gone through our first stage of sanding with our DA and the 800 and 1000 grit, we've got the paint leveled, and you'll still see some areas here where the paint's shiny. These are edges. I tend to stay away from the edges because the paint is thinner on the edges, and it will tend to level itself out enough where it really doesn't need to be cut and buffed. If you have your paint thick enough in those areas, you know you've got enough paint there, you can go ahead and lightly sand on those, and with using the DA buffer to compound with, you have less chance of burning through an edge. With a rotary buffer, you have to be very, very careful on an edge, because it's very easy to get the paint hot and to burn through it, and then you've created more problems for yourself. So the first step we're going to do now in our wet sanding process, I've got my 2 flexible sanding pads, our dual density pads, and I've got some 2000 grit. Like I said, the first stage is you're leveling the paint, getting everything flat. So we've got a nice flat paint surface now. So we come back with our 2000 grit, and we're just going to start the polishing process, believe it or not. We wrap up our paper, and what we're doing is 2 things. We're going to start the polishing process, and we're taking out those deeper sand marks that we get with the 800 and 1000 grit on the DA. The 1000 helps to take out the 800 sand scratches. 2000 is going to help to relieve that even further. So we just want to wet our paper. And here's another tip: when you fill your bottle up with water, just put a couple drops of the dish soap in there. It will help the paper slide on your surface. Instead, sometimes you'll get your paper on there and it'll start to grab on the paint. So just wet your surface down and just start to give her some sand. Now you can work up a little closer to those edges with your 2000 grit and 3000 grit. You have less of a chance of burning through an edge. It's always important to know how much paint you've got on the vehicle before you start a sanding and buffing process. Now, I painted this car last year and I know I put 3 coats of clear coat on it, so there's plenty of material there to work with. If you're doing a vehicle that you're unsure of, there are tools out there that will give you a pretty good idea of how much material is on a car. Gives you, it's called a paint thickness gauge. I've never had one. I'm not really sure exactly how they work, but I've seen them. And it's better to know how thick your paint is rather than to go into it blind if you haven't done the paint job and you don't know how much paint material is there. Just so you know where you can get more aggressive with your sanding and where you have to be very careful. Now this stage will go a little bit quicker because, like I said, we've already leveled the paint off. So we're really just trying to get out those sand scratches from that first stage and start to give it a little bit of a buff. I'll take my other sanding pad and just use it as a squeegee and wipe my water off. That'll dry pretty quick. You'll start to see just a slight change between here and here, where I've done my 2000, in the color. And when you start to look at it from the side, if you look at it in the light from the side, you can see a difference in, you'll start to see a shine come back in that paint. On the top, it's got more of a shine than in the bottom. We'll move up to the 3000 just for the sake of showing you this process. Just paper wrapped up on here. Get it wet down. Some more on the panel. And again, you're just gonna sand in your area, just trying to cover every place that you already sanded in. When you've sanded enough panels, enough years, you can feel the difference as you're sanding. It won't feel like it's grabbing as much because you've started to work that paint down, you started to polish that paint out. That's when you know you're about done with that stage. It's important too to keep the panel wet, helps the paper to slide, helps keep the panel cool. We've got that section. And you'll notice too, as I'm sanding, my residue does not have any color in it. because this again is a clear coat that we're sanding. If this was a solid color, all my sanding residue would be the color of the paint. It's another way to know too, when you're sanding on a clear coat job, if you see your residue starting to turn color, you know you've gone too far, you've broken through the clear coat, and you're into the color coat, and now you've got to do some paint repairs. All right. And again, when you look at it from the side, you can see the difference in how the panel appears. Let's see if I can bring you over here and show you. It'd be kind of hard to see with the camera, but if you see the top has started to got some shine to it. And if you look down this bottom section, it's still very hazy. Again, the difference. So you can see where the polishing process has started. Like I said, there's some guys out there that will take this one step further and go up to a 5,000 grit paper, which is going to polish this even further and make the buffing job that much less. So that's the process of color sanding on a car. Again, we start out with washing the car, and then we used our DA, our tight circle DA, with a interface pad on it to help go around curves and to lessen the harshness of the pad so we don't cut through edges by mistake. Started with 800 because this is a cured paint job. It's hardened up, and then to 1000 to take out some of those scratches. And now we started today with the wet sanding with the 2000, and then a 3000 grit, which this will leave us pretty good shape to start with our buffer. And we're going to do that in the next video. I'll take you through the buffing steps and the process to get this paint back looking shiny again and have a nice deep finish to it. So I hope you got something out of this video. If you were considering doing a wet sand job on any vehicle, you can do this to any car you have that's got a decent paint job on it and you want to kind of bring back that shine or make it just a little bit nicer looking. You can do this to any car. Get some paper, water, buy a buffing kit, and you can make the paint job look really nice. But like I said, you need to know how much clear coat there is on the car. A lot of these newer cars use a very minimal amount of clear coat because car companies are trying to save as much money as they can, and if they save a quart of clear on each car they paint times 200,000 cars, that's a lot of money in clear coat. So you got to know how much paint thickness is on your vehicle before you start sanding on it, because it's very easy to sand through it and then you've got to do some bigger paint repairs. So again, hope you got something out of this. Thanks for following along. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, tell your friends, share the video, hit that bell notification so you know when the next video in this series is going to come out, so you can watch this paint come back to life and be deeper and shinier than it was when we started. And I'll see you again on the next one.